we are live streaming tonight, and we know there are many people who are watching. We have thought about how do we understand the experience of the last couple of years since October 7th, which has been brutal for Israel, for Gaza, for the Jewish community. We have found ourselves in a tsunami of emotions, of reactions, of divisions. It's been a really rough time, and we're still feeling the effects of what's happened in the last couple of years. It's not going away, and we thought we would have a series of presentations in which we would examine different aspects of what's been happening in this past couple of years. I think we all feel that in some way we are at a crossroads, and we call this series At a Crossroads. It will be a series of 4 or 5 lectures. We have already 4 lectures that are presentations. Some are panel discussions that are already scheduled, and we may have a 5th one, but it's going to be a few months of exploration and reflection. Tonight's the first one, and we are really honored to have Amy Spitalnick and Andrew Silow-Carroll to open tonight. I will tell you the second one is with Eric Penzler from Harvard University. He was the head of the task on anti-Semitism, and it's going to be about the experience on campus primarily, and the feeling of alienation that many Jews have felt on campus, many of the students and many other parents, and how that reflects on a greater sense of alienation that many Jews are feeling today in America. After so many decades of feeling very much at home and embraced and accepted, there's a feeling that, or probably a question mark, are we really accepted? Are we really at home? So that's going to be on December 2nd. So that's a preview of what's coming. Tonight is called All Politics Are Local, and it's going to be a reflection on how the last couple of years and all the turmoil has been reflected, particularly in the last mayoral election a couple of weeks ago. So Amy Spitalnick, who was here actually as one of the moderators in the mayoral candidate debate that happened here, or conversation that happened here in the month of June. So she was together with Errol Lewis from New York One. Amy Spitalnick is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She's a national recognized leader countering anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism, and protecting democracy. Amy previously served as executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Amy has extensive experience in government politics and advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General and spokesperson and advisor to the New York City mayor. When we're not talking about Mayor Adams, and we're not talking about Mamdani, but Andrew Silow-Carroll is the editor-at-large for 70 Faces Media, the parent company of the New York Jewish Week and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. We've had actually the honor of having a number of events together with 70 Faces over the last couple of years, which were really terrific. Andrew has a career that spans more than 3 decades. He has served as editor-in-chief of the New York Jewish Week, JTA, and the New Jersey Jewish News. And his essays and columns have appeared in publications across the Jewish and general press. He lives in New Jersey and continues to write and teach widely on the changing landscape of American Jewish life. And we are really honored to have the two of you, because you both are really very steeped in the issues and the the topic of tonight. So I invite you to come. And so the way that the evening will unfold is that we will have Amy and Andrew in conversation, and then at 7:45, actually, there are cards that surely people have the cards, so cards are in the back. You can, if you have comments or questions, hopefully questions, you can write them on the cards. The cards will be collected around 7:45, and there will be then a question and answer period. We will conclude around 8:20 to 8:30, something like that. So.
Do I take that mic? Yeah, okay. Good evening, and thanks for having me. Thank you, Rabbi, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for coming here, and everyone who's watching at home. The day after Election Day this year, I was at a book event, a book launch on the Upper West Side. And it was with, let's say safely, it was American Jewish liberals. And I live in New Jersey, I should preface this by saying. And I said, they said, how are you? I said, I'm fine. I said, you must be feeling pretty good today after that election. And she said, you're kidding, right? I said, oh yeah, I don't live in New York. I forgot what might have been going through your mind. So I had a quick education in parochialism. Tonight we're going to talk about why the mayoral election was so upsetting for a lot of New Yorkers. We should preface by saying not all New Yorkers, not all New York Jews. There was a sizable vote as well, not a majority vote, so which reveals something about the tensions about this particular candidate. And we're also going to talk about the national picture that is not just about New York, even though that surprises a lot of us, right? That there were things happening in the United States that aren't about New York. So, and we're honored to, and lucky to have Amy with us to talk about these issues. So I first want to start, Amy, talking about your statement right after the election. I can paraphrase it, and you can tell me if I get it right. You emphasize that Jewish safety in New York requires working across communities and building an inclusive city where all residents are protected. You critique the divisive election rhetoric that exploited Jewish concerns while fueling Islamophobia and other bigotry. And you warned against false choices. This is a lot. I know you're going to have to unpack a lot here. You warned against false choices between Jewish security and broader democratic values. So that sets the stage. You also called on Mayor-elect Mamdani and all leaders to listen to the Jewish community, recognize legitimate fears, and ensure policies that support both Jewish safety and a strong, inclusive democracy. So maybe we can talk about what are the most significant reasons for Jewish concern. Are there early signs that they've been heard, or are there reasons for supporters of Israel and Jewish safety to be concerned?
Well, first, it's such a pleasure to be back here. It feels like that mayoral forum in June was both a million years ago and yesterday. And I'm grateful that BJ and so many others hosted that forum back in June, including New York Jewish Agenda, on whose board I sit, and a number of other organizations. And I mean, somehow now, I don't even know how many months, 5 months since that forum, it feels like we are in both a different world and not much has changed, and we're still having the same conversations that we were having then. And for me, and I think so many New Yorkers, more than anything, what has been so disheartening is how Jews became political footballs in this mayoral election. It felt like for an election on which the vast majority of New Yorkers were not voting on Israel or quote-unquote Jewish issues, we were the talk of the town. And the fact that we became these political footballs in all different directions, at the end of the day, I don't think is very good for the Jews, right? When we are the story, when we are being used as a political wedge rather than just a core constituency among many of the core constituencies that make up this incredible city, it's never good for us. And in so many ways, I think in a post-October 7th world, this election became a Rorschach test for the worst fears and instincts that so many of us are feeling on both ends of the political spectrum, right? We thought that this election was a referendum on Israel, on Jewish safety. We felt as if this was somehow going to effectively become the conduit that so many of these fears and challenges that we've been grappling with over the last 2 years were manifesting, because it was one of the few places that many of us actually had the ability to do something, to actually use our vote, and also the ways in which in the public conversation it really was being treated as this conduit, as this Rorschach test for what so many of us were feeling after October 7th. And so understanding how these worst fears and instincts really manifested in the election is important. I think, and this is true on both ends of the spectrum. On the far left, there were those who dismissed real legitimate Jewish concerns about anti-Semitism, about the ways in which a post-October 7th world we are seeing the targeting of Jews that's become increasingly violent. Certainly in the last 6 months, we've seen the firebombing of Governor Josh Shapiro's home, the Capitol Jewish Museum shooting, the Boulder attack, and the ways in which this post-October 7th hate has manifested in increasingly violent attacks on Jews and others, frankly. And then there are those who exploited our legitimate fears and concerns to advance broader divisive politics, to advance bigotry and extremism, and in some cases even Islamophobia and extremism, targeting not just the mayor-elect, but so many communities around this city and this country who were caught up in this rhetoric. And so it's felt like this race has really been a manifestation of the false choices we're being presented as Jews right now. On one side, we are being told we can't possibly care about Palestinian humanity or dignity or small d democratic values and also be proudly Jewish and be connected to Israel. And on the other, we're being told we can't counter anti-Semitism without going after the core democratic norms and values that have been so inherent to our safety. And so this race, in many ways, the mayoral race in New York, has become a manifestation of these broader national dynamics in which we as Jews are being treated as political footballs, and we're being told to choose between two extreme zero-sum binaries rather than actually recognizing we can both be unequivocally committed to Jewish safety, to countering anti-Semitism wherever it exists across the political spectrum, while also rejecting efforts to divide our communities, to undermine our democratic norms, to pit us against others, and to ultimately fuel the sort of extremism and bigotry that we know never ends well for the Jewish community. But unfortunately, it seems like this race has really become sort of a manifestation of that rather than an opportunity to move forward. And I think now we're past the election, there's a question as to what can we actually do? And there's an opportunity both for the mayor-elect and for the Jewish community to say the only choice we have right now is to work across lines of difference and figure out how we can actually, despite the real disagreements that might exist between significant parts of the Jewish community and the incoming mayor, make sure that this remains a city in which Jews and all communities are safe and can continue to thrive in the way that, for my own family and so many others, has been existential.
It's funny, you use the word, and you're not the only one, I've never heard the word security and safety used so much as over the last 6 months. And it made me think, it made a lot of us think, in my office about what do we mean when we say security and safety? So the cynics among people I know would say, well, what we really mean is safety to be able to not have our deepest beliefs challenged at a very high level. And then the other side of that says, no, this is not just about that kind of comfort. It's about encouraging people who would protest outside of synagogues, who would take over campuses. So when you think about Jewish security and safety right now, what are you most concerned about, and where do you think people should really focus their concerns?
Well, I think in many ways it's important to step back and look at the national dynamics because they're playing out both here in New York and across the country and across the globe right now. It's impossible to separate what's happening here in New York from the broader moment on anti-Semitism and anti-democratic extremism. And so, in my prior life, I ran an organization where we brought a lawsuit against the neo-Nazis who attacked Charlottesville. And these Nazis who chanted, "Jews will not replace us," carrying tiki torches and chanting things like blood and soil, it was pretty easy to understand why that anti-Semitism somehow became a threat against a variety of different communities. Because anti-Semitism isn't simply this form of bigotry targeting Jews because of who we are and what we believe and what we look like or how we pray or what we eat. It's also this insidious conspiracy theory rooted in these tropes and lies around Jewish control and power, this idea that Jews are controlling the replacement of the white race or our government or our finances or any of these things. And so in the last decade, we've seen this anti-Semitism become normalized. What happened in Charlottesville 8 years ago has now become really mainstreamed in our political rhetoric, this idea that there is an effort to replace the white race, to steal our election, to support immigrants coming into this country and otherwise replacing the population. And you see it not just fueling a cycle of violence from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history, to Poway, to El Paso, which targeted the Latino community, and Buffalo, which targeted the Black community, and Christchurch, which targeted the Muslim community, but also underpinning dehumanizing policies targeting immigrants and voting rights and so much more, this idea of replacement and invasion. And it has become so normalized in the highest levels of power in our government, from the White House on down, in a way that should concern us all. And I think if you look back to a decade ago to now, that normalization, that mainstreaming of these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories should scare us all. It's harder for some of us, particularly in progressive spaces, to see how these tropes and conspiracy theories also exist in a mirror form on the other end of the political spectrum. Saying that Jews or quote-unquote Zionists are responsible for controlling our foreign policy or our economy or our government in some way, and in their worst manifestations, holding Jews accountable for the actions of the Israeli government, and of course increasingly violently targeting us, as we saw in Pennsylvania, in DC, and in Boulder this summer. And so we know that these conspiracy theories and tropes have become very normalized on the right, from the highest levels of government in the White House on down, on the left increasingly in certain progressive and media and other spaces, in a way that is leading as well to real world violence, much like as we've seen on the right in recent years. But again, we're also being offered these false choices on both ends, where on the right, we're being told by the administration that the only way to counter anti-Semitism is to undermine our core democratic norms and values, to gut academic research like cancer and Alzheimer's research, to go after academic freedom and our universities and due process, or the right to association and organize, like the Republican effort to go after the charter of a national teachers union in the name of countering anti-Semitism right now. And on the left, again, we're being told that we can't possibly be proudly Jewish or connected to Israel and still believe in our small d democratic and humanitarian values. So we're being offered these false choices. And the ways that this is playing out is in real world attacks on the Jewish community in their worst forms, the ones I mentioned from Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway, or Josh Shapiro or Capitol Jewish Museum, or Boulder, but also ways that they're manifesting here in the city, like the protest outside the Park East Synagogue earlier this week, in which you had people screaming at, however we feel about Nefesh B'Nefesh, the Aliyah organization that was holding an event at Park East. There were people screaming about globalizing the Intifada outside a synagogue, outside a Jewish event. And that's anti-Semitism at the end of the day, even if you have specific policy disagreements with how Nefesh B'Nefesh, does work in the occupied territories or something like that. And so we're seeing this real-world manifestation of both these false choices and this increasingly normalized anti-Semitism lead to attacks on Jews, to other ways in which the Jewish community is being targeted and marginalized and ostracized in a way that, at least in my lifetime, we've never seen, and I think for many of us is certainly new and frightening. And our responsibility, whether it's as political leaders or communal leaders or average Jews and people in the city, is to figure out how we reject these false choices and binaries and help people understand that you can be unequivocally committed to countering anti-Semitism wherever it exists across the political spectrum, and to do so in a way that is also still deeply committed to democratic and humanitarian values and to the dignity of all people, and that these are not at odds with one another, but actually inextricably linked.
Thank you for that. So I want to talk about Mamdani's role in the kind of coalition building in the kind of city that you see. But first, I mean, let's talk about your, you were a mayoral aide. I guess we can say for whom that was.
For Bill de Blasio.
For Bill de Blasio.
Which, I don't know, there's a lot of de Blasio nostalgia right now, notwithstanding the page 6 stories about his love life. And
so, drawing on your experience working in city government, what can a mayor Mamdani realistically do that both threatens Jewish interests and supports Jewish interests? What is he constrained from doing just by city charter, whatever power he can accrue? And I guess in that sense, we should probably also talk about the advisors he could pick, specific policies he could enact. Well, what is a mayor really able to do that? And if you were to speak to some of the fears that people have.
Well, I think it's important to separate a few things right now. First of all, campaigning is dramatically different than governing. And anyone who's been elected to office, including Bill de Blasio or Zohran Mamdani or Eric Adams or Donald Trump or Joe Biden or anyone else, right, they recognize this very quickly. Campaigning and governing are fundamentally different things. And so everything that he talked about during the campaign in terms of his policy proposals and his broader rhetoric is going to have to meet the reality of governing. And that's true for any elected official, but I think particularly in city government, you meet that reality very quickly, particularly with like the Room 9 press corps on top of you on a minute-by-minute basis and the scrutiny that you face as mayor, which I think is unlike any other political leader in the country. And as a former press aide to the mayor, I hated it, and as a New Yorker, I appreciate it, right? I'm now raising a 3-year-old in the city and appreciate the scrutiny that the mayor faces. When I was a spokesperson for the mayor, I did not love that scrutiny as much. But I also think it's important to differentiate between policy and the bully pulpit of the mayor. If you actually look at the policies that the Mamdani campaign put forward on the issues where the mayor actually has control, right? Public safety, education, the NYPD, hate crimes prevention, they're really strong policies in many ways. He's proposing, for example, an 800% increase in funding for hate crimes prevention, integrating it in this broader Department of Community Safety, and otherwise talking about hate crimes prevention, including and especially against hate crimes targeting the Jewish community, which we know are happening at disproportionate rates, particularly targeting visibly Jewish people like Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, in real ways. And the hate crimes prevention policy that the Mamdani campaign put forward is actually rooted in some of the best practices that those of us who work in this field know and appreciate. And I hope, we need more details about what this 800% increase in funding will look like in practice, but I'm enthusiastic and optimistic about what it means to actually invest in this work, to integrate hate crimes prevention in our broader public safety infrastructure and our education infrastructure, to restore and fund and strengthen so many of the institutions that have not necessarily gotten the funding and resources they deserve. And that includes things like the City Commission on Human Rights, CCHR, which a number of organizations, including NYJA, have been fighting to see significant funding increases for, that are playing key roles in hate crimes prevention and more. And so I hope that those policies not only move forward, but that they are, detailed and fleshed out in a way that we can fully understand their impact. And this is true as well, right? The DOE just announced a few months ago this Hidden Voices curricula, which is focused on how we actually talk about Jews as human beings and integral parts of the fabric and history of the city, which all of the research tells us is actually inherent to preventing anti-Semitism. We teach about the Holocaust as a core part in fighting anti-Semitism, but that's not the only tool or even necessarily the most effective tool in countering anti-Semitism, and I say this as the grandkid of survivors. We also need to teach about who Jews are today and the contributions we make to our society today, and this curriculum is focused on that. And so there's no indication that this administration is going to roll any of that back. In fact, they've leaned into investing more deeply in some of these programs and policies, and that's something we should be supportive of and push them on and encourage more details on. The question for me is how this administration uses its bully pulpit, which I think is far more up in the air, perhaps, in terms of the concerns our community legitimately has, right? We've seen, whether it's direct comment or sort of the wishy-washiness around certain perspectives, lead to confusion at best and harm at worst. when it comes to the Jewish community. So whether it's, different answers on Hamas or these questions around, whether he will close Cornell Technion, which is the institution on Roosevelt Island, or this question around focusing on arresting Bibi Netanyahu if he comes to New York and the role of the NYPD. All of this is to say, however we feel about Bibi Netanyahu, however we feel about a variety of different policies of the Israeli government, what is the role of the New York mayor in actually doing these things? And I think, any one of us who live in the city know that the role of the mayor is not foreign policy. It's to make sure that those of us here in New York are safe and protected, and this is an inclusive city where our schools and our NYPD and our public safety infrastructure more broadly are protecting us. And do we need to be getting into fights over international law involving the NYPD and a foreign government? And do we want to be thinking about what it means to actually close an institution that is bringing thousands of jobs and education to the city? And I think once he gets into office, it seems absurd that he would even consider doing those things. And again, it gets to this question of governing versus campaigning. And so for me, this real question is how he uses this bully pulpit. Can he be speaking clearly and directly about the importance of making sure this is a city in which Jews and all people are truly safe, are truly protected, that even if we have fundamental disagreements over foreign policy, every single Jew in this city deserves to be safe, and that we are entitled to the same rights and safety as any other community. And I think using that bully pulpit to do that, to avoid some of the back and forth and wishy-washiness that has characterized the last few months, is something that I hope he'll do not just during this transition, but especially once he's in office on January 1st. And so for us as New Yorkers looking at what to expect, I hope we can both distinguish between the policy and the bully pulpit and make sure that he's using both to advance our safety and inclusion and the safety and inclusion of all communities in the city. And there's a huge opportunity to do that. I think a huge opportunity both for Mayor-elect Mamdani to do that, and a huge opportunity for us as Jews to use the levers of our civic and democratic engagement through the city council and the other tools we have to keep advocating for that. And there are checks and balances in our government to make sure that we can do that. So we should keep using our voices to make sure that this is a city that truly protects all of us. And so too is it incumbent on this administration to engage with the full diversity and breadth of the Jewish community to make sure each and every one of us feels safe in the city.
I want to stay on bully pulpit just for a second and ask about, I think one concern I hear about the rhetoric, and maybe wishy-washy is a good thing because it's, at least it's washy. The wishy was the real problem there for a while, right? So maybe he's moderating to some degree. But I think what I hear a lot of concern, they use that phrase permission structure. And that being able to talk about a Jewish state from the highest office in New York, that, it can be a state, but maybe not a Jewish state, a state for all its people. I don't know if globalizing intifada is a good phrase or not phrase, we can debate that. That creates permission for people who would say and do many worse things. And I wonder if, I know JCPA is not a organization that's, you're not set up as an Israel Defense Organization, unlike many other Jewish organizations. But how do you think about the normalization of anti-Zionism, I guess, is really what I'm going after here. And does that pose, if not an existential threat for Jews, at least a certain, threat to their comfort level?
Well, I think at the core of this question is this idea or this debate or this confusion over the fact that we're not even speaking the same language as many people, right? Intifada, Zionism, it means different things to different people depending on who you ask. And so some of the public debates we've had as part of this mayoral race and more broadly over the last few years are actually rooted in this fundamental misalignment over what these terms even mean, right? Terms like intifada. For some people, right, I think about a Lebanese American colleague of mine who I work closely with. She talks about how to her kids it's a term of resistance. For me, my formative years understanding Israel were the second intifada. I lived in Israel a few years after the second intifada. I watched the pizzeria and bus and nightclub bombings. I went to Hebrew University where the cafeteria was bombed, and I walked past that memorial every single day for a year when I studied there. For me, that's my formative understanding of Israel. And I grew up at a time when it was facing real daily deadly threat, which perhaps is different notwithstanding October 7th, than what many younger folks are dealing with now. And so it's this fundamental question about the fact that we're not even speaking the same language. I think Zionism too, right? It's become this political term that has been thrown around on college campuses, on social media, in the media. For me, Zionism is simply the belief that Jews are entitled to self-determination somewhere in this place in the world where we have deep historical connections. It goes hand in hand with my belief in Palestinian self-determination, dignity, and human rights. In fact, I think one can't exist without the other. But at a moment when we're hearing calls to ban and boycott Zionists, and 80 to 90% of American Jews have a relationship with Israel and believe in Jewish self-determination, even if we fundamentally disagree with its government and its policies over the last few years especially, but frankly long before that, that becomes a form of anti-Semitic discrimination if you're saying those of us with a connection to Israel are not welcome in certain spaces on college campuses or, you know, artists, authors, so many other ways we've seen this manifest in recent years. And so at the very least, we need to start by actually having the same understanding of these terms. And so for me, the question is, how are we actually understanding this? And I appreciate the ways in which the mayor-elect evolved on Globalize the Intifada. He had conversations with a number of Jewish leaders where it was made clear how deeply personally we hear terms like intifada, how it harkens back to these dark days of the early 2000s, of the bus bombings and nightclub, the Dolphinarium, other things like that. And to his credit, he evolved and said, I actually understand the harm that this term elicits in so many Jewish New Yorkers, and I discourage people from using it, and I don't use it. And did he say everything that every Jew wanted to hear him say? Of course not. But he showed a willingness to evolve, and that's something that we should appreciate. And it tells us that there's an opportunity to engage, even if we're not going to get everything that we necessarily want. For me, the broader question around, you know, the failure to believe that Israel should exist as a Jewish state or Jewish self-determination, for me, that's a broader question. I struggle with that. I think that's a place where we have both fundamental disagreement and a place where perhaps his position on Israel is different than it might be for any other country or any other people. And that gets to this fundamental question of both what Jewish self-determination and Zionism is and how we start creating a shared understanding of it, but also the ways in which, you know, I don't believe that anti-Semitism is inherently anti-Semitic, but in practice, we've seen, particularly over the last few years, the ways in which it has... Sorry, did I say?
Yeah, you said anti-Semitism is...
Sorry, I don't believe that anti-Zionism is always or inherently anti-Semitic, but we've seen in many ways the ways in which anti-Zionism can translate into anti-Semitism when Jews are uniquely targeted or Israel is uniquely targeted as the Jewish homeland. And so it's incumbent, I think, both on the mayor-elect and the Jewish community to have frank conversations about what this means in practice, both in terms of keeping the Jewish community here safe and more broadly what it means in terms of the policies and ideas that have been floated. And so I think we can appreciate where the mayor-elect has evolved, and we can push back where we have seen policies and rhetoric that are still harmful or painful for many of us.
So let's talk about the roles of, just so people understand how the JCPA works. It's sort of a coordinator of the networks of Jewish community relation councils around the country, which are JCRCs. They're kind of the State Department for your local Jewish municipality. So they've historically focused on building coalitions. That's usually around shared causes, like civil rights, religious freedom, public safety. Let's talk tachlis about how, whether it's the New York JCRC or your national organization, what are some of your tools for wielding influence, moderating, expressing displeasure, and have you, and maybe you could tell us a little bit how you've actually, you know, flexed those muscles over the last couple of months. Just, and again, we're not going to only talk about New York tonight, but in the New York context.
I mean, those of us in New York think that we're the center of the universe, and I don't think that's wrong in many ways. And also, you know, New York is not the rest of the country, and the rest of the country is not New York. And so in terms of what's happening here, is this a national trend? We can talk about that, I'm sure, as well. But look, at the core of our work at JCPA, and I think more broadly at the core of any community relations and coalition building that we as a Jewish community do, is this recognition that Jewish safety and democracy are inextricably linked. We as Jews are never going to be safe in this country if democracy is undermined. Inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith democracy has been existential to our advancement and to our safety in this country for so many different reasons. My grandparents came here after surviving the war. They drove a taxi and worked as a seamstress on the Lower East Side, and it was through, our unions and other infrastructure that they advanced, and democratic infrastructure. And my parents were New York City public school teachers and members of U of T, and it was through that they advanced and built a life in which I could go on to do what I did. And so we know that inclusive democracy, pluralistic democracy, and the very levers of them have been at the core of, I think, probably everyone in this room's safety and advancement in this country for multiple generations at this point. And when democracy is eroded, when distrust in our democracy and our institutions is allowed to be normalized, it only creates the conditions for anti-Semitism to flourish and thrive, because people are looking for a scapegoat. But so too, there's no such thing as truly inclusive, multiracial, multi-faith democracy if the Jewish community is not safe in every way, shape, and form. And those people who claim to be committed to pluralistic, inclusive democracy need to ensure that they're committed to Jewish safety and the safety of all communities. And at a time when anti-Semitism is rising disproportionately, when we're seeing hate crimes both here in New York and around the country targeting the Jewish community at record levels, we need to make sure that our partners and our allies understand that they are not safe, that our democracy is not safe unless Jews are safe. And so our work is really rooted in this framework, that there's no such thing as inclusive democracy without Jewish safety, and there's no Jewish safety without inclusive democracy. And we're doing this in a variety of ways. We work in civil rights coalitions, like the Leadership Conference, which is the preeminent national civil rights coalition, founded in 1950 actually by JCPA and the NAACP, as well as some labor unions. We work with teachers unions and a variety of others at a time when these coalitions, frankly, are more fraught than they have been in a long time. I started my role a month before October 7th. I knew I'd be walking into a challenging space. I don't think I fully recognized how challenging it would actually become. But there's also been real reason for hope in these spaces. In the Leadership Conference, for example, which is led by Maya Wiley, which many of us remember from the last mayoral election, and she was my colleague at City Hall over a decade ago in the de Blasio administration. We've worked tirelessly both behind the scenes and publicly to keep this coalition together despite the challenges of October 7th and its aftermath. And in particular, seeing how we both were able to, as they put out statements on campus protests and other issues, make sure that they both were unequivocally committed to civil rights and civil liberties and free speech, and also acknowledge the reality of anti-Semitism on certain campuses for students and faculty was important. And so too, this past spring, after the Capitol Jewish Museum and Boulder shootings, we worked with the Leadership Conference to organize a statement of 65 civil rights groups, making unequivocally clear that when Jews are targeted over Israel, that's anti-Semitism, period, full stop. And for this coalition, which included Muslim and Arab American and Latino and LGBTQ and other groups, to say this, when I've never heard most of those organizations say as much, that felt really important at a time when many of us were feeling isolated or being told that 2 Israeli embassy staffers outside a Jewish event at a Jewish museum being shot was somehow not anti-Semitism. It felt important to hear our civil rights allies and partners say that. And so our work is really helping to advance this understanding in these coalitions. So too, right now, we're seeing both real challenges in certain teachers' unions where Jewish educators or students or others are feeling ostracized or marginalized in certain spaces. Thankfully here in New York a little bit less so, but in other localities this is a real challenge. But also we're seeing the weaponization and exploitation of real Jewish fears to go after the right to association and organize, including going after the charter of the National Education Association, which is one of 2 national teachers' unions. And so we have a formal partnership with the American Federation of Teachers. We work with the NEA and are doing workshops and trainings for their union leaders around anti-Semitism. And we're launching local partnerships and pilots to bring the Jewish community together with the unions in a way that is aimed to reduce some of these tensions and zero-sum approaches that have just been so detrimental to both Jewish safety, but also to protecting the core democratic norms and values and right to organize and other key key values that I think have been so important to so many communities, including the Jewish community. And so it's not easy, it's not sort of particularly, it doesn't fit neatly into a tweet or into the binaries that shape this conversation, but this is actually the messy space where we can all do the work, helping people understand that we can all believe in multiple truths at the same time, that we can be unequivocally committed to countering anti-Semitism and don't want to do so in a way that undermines our democratic norms and values, that we can be deeply committed to Jewish safety and self-determination, but also committed to humanitarian rights and dignity for all people. And so it's this messy, sort of nuanced space where I think the work actually happens, even if it doesn't sort of grab the headlines that so many other organizations and work might get.
Right, and I think what is grabbing the headlines are some organizations that were historically committed to that coalition building to, if the Jewish community isn't safe, other communities aren't safe, other communities aren't safe, the Jewish community. But how do you respond to someone who says, you know what, that's all well and good when we're not so under attack, but given limited resources and given limited manpower, the Jewish community really needs to turn inward and focus on these external threats, even if it means that we can't make coalitions with people who, at some level, we don't think have our best interests at heart. I'm sure you're hearing that, and I'm just curious how you respond.
I mean, we're not going to solve anti-Semitism by talking to people who already agree that anti-Semitism is a problem and with our approach to solving it. We're going to solve anti-Semitism by engaging with people with whom we might have disagreements, who might have fundamental policy conflicts related to Israel or Gaza, but are willing to engage in good faith. And so I'll share sort of anecdotally, I probably shared this, I'm sure with some folks in the room. Last summer, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez invited me to do a webinar with her on anti-Semitism, which I appreciated, right? She's someone who some in our community have very strong feelings about related to her policies on Israel and Gaza. And there are real disagreements there between real significant parts of the Jewish community and her policies. But she wanted to hold this webinar on anti-Semitism and asked me if I would come and speak. And so I said, of course. And very quickly, both of us were canceled by the extremes of our community. The right wing of our community said, how dare you engage with her? The far left said, how dare you platform a Zionist like JCPA and Amy? We had this conversation, you can watch it online, it's a 35-minute YouTube, where we talked about everything, including a lot of the topics we've talked about, what anti-Semitism looks like across the ideological spectrum. She spoke about how she believed it was a threat to progressive values, to peace in the region. I talked about what being Zionist, or what Zionism actually means to me as a progressive, liberal New Yorker and Jew. And we had this frank conversation. Perhaps even more importantly, the day after this conversation was this really horrific anti-Semitic protest down by the Nova Memorial on Wall Street, if you all remember this. It was people surrounding this memorial and effectively protesting a memorial for dead Jews and other people who were massacred at the Nova Festival. And to her credit, she put out an unequivocal statement making clear that this was anti-Semitism. And that was important in and of itself because she was, at the time, and perhaps still is, although our new mayor might give her a run for her money, the most prominent progressive in the country. And also created permission structure for other progressive electeds to say, hey, look, you can actually condemn anti-Semitism and it doesn't take away from our progressive values and bona fides. And a few weeks later, she was unendorsed by a chapter of the Democratic Socialists who specifically cited this webinar and her conversation with me and JCPA and her office has since been targeted and graffitied for the fact that she voted for Iron Dome, even though she opposes offensive arms sales to Israel. And so the question for us is, how do we actually find those people who are willing to have the conversations in good faith, have those constructive dialogues, even if we don't agree on everything, versus those like the DSA members who sought to unendorse her, who will never see the humanity of Jews or Israelis, because even a conversation about anti-Semitism between two progressive women was somehow beyond the pale for them, right? And so for me, we have to figure out those places where we can engage constructively, even across real lines of disagreement, versus those where engagement is not going to prove fruitful, and we can actually fracture off those with whom we can engage with those who will never see our humanity and dignity. And I think it's hard, right? It's not easy to have conversations across these lines of disagreement, but it's actually something that each and every one of us can do in our own communities, in our own workplaces and neighborhoods and families and other places where these issues are playing out. And I hope that as we look towards this new administration and more broadly, there's actually an opportunity to figure out where those constructive conversations and engagement can take place versus where we shouldn't really waste our breath and our time at a moment that is so tenuous and we only have so much emotional energy for these conversations.
You talked earlier about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. I just want to remind people what that means. I think we're talking about the universities, the Trump administration threatening, pulling back funding, using depending on your politics, the justification or the pretext that the schools poorly handled the October 7th protests. How do you say in your role as as in community relations, thanks but no thanks? But what I mean by that is, how do you kind of, I guess maybe encourage the impulse, but then come back, and is it even possible with this administration to be able to say, but maybe this is how we would prefer you handle it for our own self-interest?
Thanks but no thanks is probably nicer than how we've said it over the last few months, I would say. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should have said it. But look, I think it's right. Anti-Semitism is real. It exists across the political spectrum, and anyone who is trying to gaslight into thinking that it's not real right now is just doing that, right? They're gaslighting us, and we have to be clear-eyed about the reality of anti-Semitism. It exists on the right. We've seen it normalized over the last decade, as we talked about, and it exists on the ideological left in increasingly violent ways, as we've seen in Boulder and DC and with Governor Josh Shapiro and more broadly. And so we can't deny that reality, and I think there are some who are trying to deny that reality. It's important to understand that on one side, for example, on the right, it's state-related anti-Semitism in certain cases where we're seeing the administration appoint avowed neo-Nazis and other extremists to government roles, including folks like Paul Ingrassia, who quite literally says he has a Nazi streak and has been, repeatedly appointed to various roles after being withdrawn from one appointment. He was just appointed last week to the General Services Administration, and yet another role, the Department of Defense spokesperson, and obviously the ways in which, today there was a story about how the Coast Guard basically said that swastikas and nooses are no longer hate symbols, right? We can go on and on about the ways in which this hate and extremism has been normalized by the federal government. And thankfully, at least on the left, we're not seeing that level of state-run anti-Semitism and extremism, but we're seeing it being normalized in other ways that we should be clear-eyed about, even if they're manifesting differently. And so none of us should be gaslit into thinking that anti-Semitism isn't real and that it doesn't exist in these different forms across the ideological spectrum. But we all should be clear-eyed about the fact that the way to fight it is not to exploit our real legitimate fears to go after the very infrastructure and institutions and tools and norms and rule of law that have been so inherent to our safety and advancement in this country. And when one person is targeted, whether it's a Palestinian American activist at Columbia or Tufts University or something like that, or anyone else, it's gonna come for the Jewish community at some point. We are not gonna be safe if anyone is targeted. And whether it's a university seeing cancer and Alzheimer's research being gutted in the name of countering anti-Semitism, which of course itself is going to lead to increased anti-Semitism because Jews are responsible for this work now being gutted and attacked, whether it's academic freedom being attacked, whether it's due process and other civil liberties and rights, whether it's the right to association and to organize, as we talked about with the ways in which unions are now being targeted in the name of anti-Semitism. And I would say the ways in which the federal government is weaponizing its power to go after localities, right? We heard after the election, the administration and the president say that they plan to gut federal funding to New York because they don't like our new mayor. What is that gonna actually mean for us, right? Education, social services, public safety, the very ways in which this city functions are being threatened in the name of countering anti-Semitism and fighting our new mayor. That's not gonna make Jews more safe, that's gonna make us less safe, and it's gonna make us the scapegoat for so much bigotry and hatred because we are the excuse that this administration is using to fundamentally undermine the fabric of the city and our democracy. And so we need to be able to do both things. We need to be clear-eyed about the reality of anti-Semitism wherever it exists and advance the policies and the efforts to fight it across the ideological spectrum. And we need to also push back against those who are exploiting and weaponizing our real fears to undercut our democracy, to attack our cities and our communities, and to attack the rule of law in a way that makes us as Jews and so many other communities less safe rather than more safe. And it's not easy, right? I think it's much easier to just see this in zero-sum binary terms, but at the end of the day, it's living in that complexity. It's recognizing that we can hold two thoughts at the same time that actually is where most of us are. And if you look at the poll data from Ipsos and Pew and so many others who have surveyed our community, it's where we actually are as well. And so we need to keep reminding people that these two truths are true at the same time.
So I think cards have been going around for questions, so write down your questions and I'll try to get to as many as I can. And Rabbi, if whenever you want to drop them off of me, I'll be happy to. I wonder if you think, I guess it was a good sign that the GOP is fighting over this Nick Fuentes character. Nick Fuentes is this 27-year-old influencer, I guess, and what he influences people to do is hate, I think might be the best way to say it. And I know the GIP has been having a debate whether it all came to a head when Tucker Carlson platformed him on his very popular podcast. So I just wanted to agree, is that a good sign that there's some shame around this kind of normalization of far-right anti-Semitism?
Well, I'll say a few things, and I think, look, I'm not sure I'm someone who fully believed in the horseshoe effect until the last few years, but I think I kind of believe it now.
I'm sorry, the which effect?
The horseshoe effect, in which you see the most extreme voices on either ends of the political spectrum kind of come together, right? The ways in which Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes are actually in many ways echoing some of the same points as the far left extremists on Israel and anti-Semitism, right? This America First approach, or the ways in which we shouldn't be supporting Israel or Jews are controlling foreign policy. There's a mirror image happening there. And so that in and of itself is important. But I'll say a few things. I think one, I can't believe we're still talking about Nick Fuentes. This is someone who 8 years ago kind of made a name for himself in Charlottesville and was so clearly a Nazi that should have been understood as one, and yet 8 years later, he continues to get a platform. He has dinner with the president. He's platformed on Tucker Carlson, who in himself has done more to normalize anti-Semitism and extremism than almost anyone. And so we're still talking about this guy 8 years after his big coming out at Charlottesville, and that is like a testament to how normalized this extremism has become. And while I appreciate that there are Republican and conservative leaders who have spoken out against Tucker Carlson platforming Nick Fuentes, and there's this fight happening in the Heritage Foundation now between those who, sort of are opposed to this versus those that support it, at the end of the day, if these people ostensibly care about Jewish safety, they would also call out and criticize all of the ways in which anti-Semitism is being normalized on the right, from the officials like Pauline Gracia and the Department of Defense press secretary and others who have been given senior roles in this government, to the White House normalizing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, to the ways in which this administration has gutted programs that are core to Jewish safety, like hate crimes prevention funding, the Office of Civil Rights, which it's totally decimated and has now threatened to move out of the Department of Ed, which it's also gutted. This is the office that's actually responsible for protecting Jewish students on campus and in K through 12 schools, which is ostensibly the whole thing we're talking about here in terms of anti-Semitism. It's gutted the very office and legal tools we have to actually do that, to playing politics with nonprofit security grants, basically telling synagogues and other Jewish institutions they have to accept anti-immigration and anti-DEIA clauses in order to get security cameras and other physical security measures. And so if this administration truly cared about protecting Jewish safety, it wouldn't be gutting these programs, it wouldn't be appointing anti-Semitic extremists to senior roles in the government, and it wouldn't be normalizing these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So any of us who care about Jewish safety or anyone's safety need to be willing to call it out wherever it exists, on the right, on the left. So I appreciate those who are calling out Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson, but they need to be calling it out wherever it exists in their own party and on their own side of the ideological spectrum, even when it's the White House. And so it might be easier to do so when it's Fuentes and Carlson, but they also need to do so when it's Trump in the White House.
Tell me a little bit about kind of the network that you are, you can use the word coordinate, advise, and tell me just a little bit about what people in other communities can expect from their community relations councils and how you assist that.
So there's 125 Jewish community relations councils around the country. If you know one JCRC, you know one JCRC, because none of them are exactly the same. And so here in New York, we have an independent JCRC. In other cases, it's like one staff member or a part-time staff member in-house in a federation. And I would say over the last few decades, we as a community have actually dramatically underinvested in community relations. We're always wringing our hands saying, where are our relationships? Where are our coalitions? Why aren't people showing up for us? Well, we decided to redirect funding and resources from the very professionals and leaders who are on the front lines of building these relationships, and then are looking around wondering why we don't have these relationships. We should be investing in community relations, first and foremost. I was just with the JCRC directors from around the country earlier this week in DC, and they're incredible, tireless professionals who are overworked, underpaid, and don't nearly have the capacity or the colleagues that they need to do this work. If they are supposed to be the front lines of our community, we are not resourcing them in the way that they deserve. And I would say community relations professionals also just aren't the JCRCs, as important as they are, but it's rabbis and JCCs and so many others who are really the voices of our community in interfaith coalitions and civil rights coalitions and pro-immigration coalitions supporting those in our cities who are under attack right now with ICE raids and so much more. And so part of our work at JCPA is not just to support the JCRCs and other community relations professionals and leaders, although we do that in multiple ways. We provide professional development support, mentorship, programming, affinity groups, so much more. But we also are really focused on how we help people advance this understanding about the deep intersection of Jewish safety and democracy. So whether it's rabbis and clergy or others who are on the front lines, or our partners in the civil rights and labor and democracy and other spaces, the way that we're actually going to effectively counter anti-Semitism and not just be in a reactive posture is to help people understand that our safety as Jews is inextricably linked with the fabric of a multiracial, multi-faith, inclusive democracy, and one can't exist without the other. And so our work is really rooted in that framework, and we do it through a variety of tools, including not just resourcing community relations professionals and leaders, as I talked about, but working in these coalitions, working to train and offer workshops to union leaders and so much more, and to do advocacy on both the national level and particularly right now with such stagnation in Washington, identifying the state and local policies that we could lift up as models at a time when it feels like we're not going to get much done in Washington and the real opportunities are on the state and local levels.
We'd spoken earlier this week about, and you made the distinction about JCPA being nonpartisan, which doesn't necessarily mean bipartisan. I think sometimes, I'll be honest, in our, we'll reflexively refer to it as a liberal organization. I don't think you agree with that. I mean,
the Jewish community is a liberal community, okay. So I would argue that JCPA is sort of where the center of gravity is on the Jewish community. Right. If you look at the poll data, and we did a really crazy thing for a long time in our history. We decided to have these plenaries where 145 Jewish organizations, national and local, some people in this room might have been there, I was looking at Nancy, would argue about Jewish policy until the early hours of the morning and reach quote unquote consensus policy on behalf of the Jewish community. And so there's an actual document that is supposed to be consensus policy on behalf of our community on everything from Israel to immigration to democracy and voting rights to social services and SNAP and everything you could imagine. And while we haven't done this in 5 or 6 years, thankfully we've gotten rid of that part of our work, because I think the idea of having consensus policy on anything in the year 2025 is ridiculous. We actually have this document that tells us where the center of gravity was on Jewish politics and policy for a very long time. And so if you look at this document, it's on our website, tells us that most of the positions we're taking, that I suspect many of us in this audience probably share, are actually where the majority of our community is. And the poll data that we've had since then tends to back that up, that we of course, care deeply about Jewish safety, about the security of Israel, and also don't necessarily agree with its government. We don't want to see our democracy undermined in the name of countering anti-Semitism, believe that voting rights and immigration rights and LGBTQ rights and so much more should be protected, and they go hand in hand with our safety. And so I would argue that where we are, we're nonpartisan, we don't take electoral positions, we don't endorse in races, but we're a fundamentally liberal organization because the Jewish community is a fundamentally liberal community, even if there's a diversity of opinion and debate on specifics. And so understanding where the center of gravity is in our community on these policies is important. And that doesn't mean that there's unanimity on everything, but I think there are some core values that many of us share, and we're hearing some extreme voices trying to argue that these values are not necessarily representative of the majority of us when I think they are.
I'm going to read a couple audience questions now. Someone who is actually from the New York Jewish Agenda. You're on the board of the New York Jewish Agenda. And they ask, are you optimistic that, this is NYJA, New York Jewish Agenda, and you can explain what it is uniquely positioned to bridge the divide that was all too evident in the election. Are you optimistic that it is possible? And how?
It has to be, right? We have no other choice. I will say, both personally and professionally, I'm raising a 3-year-old Jewish kid in this city. So I feel like we have no other choice but to figure out how we bridge this divide and make sure that it's a city where I can raise my daughter safely, the same way that my parents grew up here and their parents who survived the Holocaust came here and raised them. And so I think we really have no other choice. And if we can't figure it out here in New York, I don't know where we can figure it out. New York Jewish Agenda is a relatively new organization compared to JCPA, which is 81 years old, but it's been around for 5 or 6 years now. And specifically really carving out a space that I think represents the progressive and liberal majority of New York Jews who believe in the safety and security of Israel, believe that anti-Semitism is real in all of its forms, and also believe deeply in the core liberal and progressive values and policies that have been so important to our community and our safety for a long time. And so I'm really proud to be on the board with a number of amazing New Yorkers, including my rabbi and others. Nancy Kaufman is here, our board chair, and a member of BJ. And Felisa Wisdom is the executive director, who I'm sure some of you have met. They were a co-sponsor of tonight and also a co-sponsor of the mayoral forum in June. That was really fun to moderate. Fun being a loose term. And
it's how Jewish communal professionals have fun.
Yes. I was also, as a former spokesperson for politicians, it was fun to be on the other side of the table and really see how I drove people like you as journalists nuts when I couldn't get straight answers out of some of the candidates. Right. So, I believe deeply, NYJA on the local level, JCPA, and other like-minded institutions on the national level are at the core of our efforts to bridge this divide, and that's true not just within the Jewish community. We need to start by bridging the divides within our own community, and this election really showed those divides within our own community. I think, you and I talked the other day about how in the Jewish community there are the catastrophizers, there are the Mamdani supporters, and there are those people who are just saying, wait and see. And we're pretty divided right now about what's going to happen. And how do we actually come together around a shared vision for what Jewish safety in this city and this country look like at a time when we were so divided over the mayoral race and broader post-October 7th dynamics? We have to start within our community, and we need institutions like NYJA and JCPA and others to help us do that. But it also requires doing it more broadly as part of these coalitions and interfaith and civil rights spaces where we also need to begin to bridge these divides.
Someone asked about other Jewish organizations that have red lines, for example, Hillel International and some, I think some it's so hard to say, CRCs that actually say if you're a non-Zionist Jewish organization, you can't be part of our coalition. Does JCPA have any red lines, and what would they be?
I mean, for me, the biggest question is sort of what I talked about earlier, right? How do we find that line between those who are willing to engage in good faith and see our humanity and dignity, even if we don't share agreement on every policy, versus those who will never see our humanity and dignity and don't believe in any fundamental Jewish human rights or or other rights, right? And so that like AOC DSA example for me is actually one of the most informative in terms of how we do our work. AOC, someone I disagree with, I've publicly and privately disagreed with her both before and after this webinar on various comments she's made. And also we had a good faith conversation about Israel and anti-Semitism in a way that I felt like it was constructive and it moved the needle forward, and she helped model what it looks like to engage on this in a way that was meaningful and created permission for others to do the same. Those who decided that sort of conversation were beyond the pale, or her support for Israeli self-defense while opposing offensive arms sales is worthy of graffitiing her office, I'm not sure that those people will ever engage with us in good faith. So for me, that's sort of the red line, right? I will talk to people like AOC and the mayor-elect and others who are willing to actually engage in good faith even if we have real disagreements, and I don't think it's worth our breath to talk to those who will never see us as human beings or as worthy of that humanity and dignity. And our job is to keep moving that line further and further to the extremes and help people understand what it means to see Jewish humanity and dignity in all of its forms, and to also help our community really understand that we can have real disagreements on issues like Israel and Gaza and do so in a way that allows us to talk across these lines of disagreement at a time when they're only going to become more pronounced, and we have to figure out a way to do so.
A few people want you to weigh in on Brad Lander. There is
all the easy questions.
So just a little background. Brad Lander is city controller, is that right? City controller, was a supporter of Mamdani during the campaign. Critics would say that he koshered Mamdani in the sense that he showed that he had the support of a prominent Jewish official. It's come now to creating an administration, and it doesn't appear that Brad Lander is going to be part of that. Should we draw any significance from that?
I would not draw any significance from that. And I will say first and foremost, Dean Foulahan, who is the first deputy mayor, was one of my bosses when I worked in city government, truly one of the best public servants that you could ever imagine. This man is more committed to public service and is probably one of the most brilliant budget and governance minds that you could ever need. And so the idea that like Dean Foulahan is sort of the consolation prize for Brad Lander is ridiculous. We're very lucky to have Dean Foulahan in city government again. He was the budget director and then first deputy mayor in the de Blasio administration, and was just appointed by Mayor-elect Mamdani as first deputy mayor, I think, last week. And I will always be a Dean Foulahan stan. I think he is truly one of the best public servants we have. And I got to see it firsthand when I worked in city government, someone who puts politics aside to protect the city, and at a time when the federal government is threatening to dramatically cut funding, there's no one better to have in that seat than Dean. And so I think first and foremost, that's important to note, and for me that also gives me a lot of confidence in the appointments that this administration is making, his transition team as well, right? People like Maria Torres Springer and others who are chairing his transition committee are among some of the best and brightest public servants that I've had the pleasure of working with. Maria goes to my synagogue, recently converted to Judaism. Like these are amazing public servants who also actually know and understand the New York Jewish community. And so I'm thrilled by some of the appointments this administration has made, and that should give us all a lot of confidence and hope, and particularly around this question of, should Brad Lander have been first deputy mayor? I think we're pretty good with Dean Foulahan, and Brad seems to be figuring out his own political path. I've known him for a long time. He was my, city councilman and our comptroller, and he's now, exploring his next political steps. And I run a nonpartisan organization, so my get out of jail free card is I can't possibly comment on an upcoming election. And I'll just say, I think, there were many Jewish and other elected officials who endorsed Mamdani, and that doesn't make them bad Jews. It means that they decided that this is who they wanted to support in this race. And when we start dividing Jews into good and bad camps because we disagree with their political opinions, that only gives license to attacking the quote-unquote bad Jews. We've seen the president and others try to do this, and those who are trying to do that in this case are intentional or not only advancing that same framework. And so I've been fortunate to know Brad for a very long time. I've appreciated his leadership on a number of fronts, including when he was thrown down on the ground and arrested by federal immigration agents earlier this year. And he signs my parents' pension checks. And And I think, you know, whatever he chooses to do next, I don't think we should look at it in the lens of his endorsements in the mayoral race or whether or not he became first deputy mayor, and rather look at who's actually in these seats, like people like Dean Foulihan, who I think will really guide the city in the direction we need at a time when there are real threats to our finances and our government.
Okay, thank you. Thanksgiving is coming up, and I think it's often seen as a time when people have difficult conversations with themselves and their relatives. You do community relations, but do you also do family relations? And what do you say, how do you keep conversations like that where there's going to be Zionist and anti-Zionist and right-wing and left-wing? How do you keep those conversations from going out of control?
Oh God, if I had the answer to this, I'd be very rich, I feel like. Look, I mean, we're all struggling with this, right? And I think at the end of the day, the divisions that are existing in our city and in our politics more broadly are really just manifestations of the divisions that exist within our own Jewish community. And the place I would start, and I spoke at this event a few weeks ago marking the 30th anniversary of Rabin's assassination. And for me, it was so almost like shocking and poignant, because in my head, first of all, how has it been 30 years? I thought it was maybe 20, right? And at the same time, when you look at that trajectory, the fact that it has been 30 years, I'm the last generation of Americans that knew an Israel that was led by someone who isn't Bibi Netanyahu, that faced real violent existential threat on a regular basis, notwithstanding October 7th, that really sort of the prospects for peace is real. And when you think about younger Jews and younger Americans more broadly, it's not shocking that their frame of reference is as bleak as it is when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, because their only frame of reference is an Israel led by Netanyahu that has, you know, really not seen a leader committed to peace in any real way, which isn't to justify anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism or October 7th or any of that, but we have to understand the frame of reference in which younger Americans and Jews are approaching this. And so how do we actually show people that there's a way to still be deeply committed to Israel's security and future, and it's consistent with humanitarian rights and dignity and self-determination for the Palestinians at a time when I think so much of our Jewish communal infrastructure has really painted it in zero-sum black and white terms, and it's been harder for particularly younger Jews to find their place in that conversation. And so I would go into any family conversation, whether it's with Jewish family members or non-Jewish family members, with that understanding about first that generational divide, and it not being sort of a question of commitment to Jewish values or safety, but rather a question of understanding of this conflict and the reality in which they've grown up, and how do we actually help change the reality and fight for a reality in which there actually is a prospect for peace. And so I don't know what the answer is there, right? There's elections in Israel next year. We don't do electoral politics, so I can't give you an answer as to what we should be doing as American Jews, but I do think that we can be clear, we can be deeply committed to Jewish safety and to Israel's future and still have real fundamental disagreements and problems and opposition to its government and leaders at a time when so many are being told it's either or and not both and.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll try to apply that to our own table.
I'll let you know how my Thanksgiving goes too, because it's going to happen there.
To me, it's just like change the subject.
Yeah.
I don't think you have that luxury, but to me, it's like change the subject. What are you watching on Netflix?
Exactly. But it's somehow about anti-Semitism and Jewish politics too.
It gets there anyway. Someone's asking about the Columbia encampment. I think this is one of the worst. This is one of the worst case scenario feelings of some people who are worried about the administration. Is that should the encampments come back, or if there's any massive pro-Palestinian demonstration, that the police would not be deployed in an effective way? That assumes a lot, that question. I guess my question would be, what did we learn from the handling of the encampments and large protests? And how would you counsel, if asked, a mayoral team that says, how do we assure Jewish safety and public safety and support free expression?
I would say first and foremost, this shouldn't be an issue that the mayor should address, but rather the universities should address. And part of the challenge was that there was inconsistent enforcement of codes of conduct, of time, place, and manner restrictions, and other things across universities in the first sort of year after October 7th, so that it gave an excuse for local governments or others to come in and effectively try to take over. And so what we need to see is universal and uniform enforcement of codes of conduct and time, place, and manner restrictions, regardless of people's beliefs or political identities or proclivities, so that if you are pro-Israel or anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian or anti-Palestinian or whatever you might be, we're all being treated the same way, regardless of our political identities and opinions. And that in turn means that there's uniform enforcement of these codes of conduct and time, place, and manner restrictions on campuses, and it makes it harder for a local government to feel the need to come in, as we saw in Columbia in certain cases. So first and foremost, it's on the university administrators to do this and to do it well. And we've seen, thank goodness, I think over the last year, a real shift there where we haven't seen the sorts of protests and encampments that have fundamentally infringed on students' rights to learn and live and walk around freely in the way that we were seeing perhaps a year and a half ago or so. And so that's the first responsibility is on universities, and that's important. And I would say the same threshold holds for mayoral administrations. I think it needs to be a really high threshold for the NYPD to enter a college campus. And we know historically what that has meant during the civil rights movement and otherwise. And so we need to have a very high threshold for that, where violence is a possibility, where safety is at risk, and instead enforce this through the codes of conduct and time, place, and manner restrictions that are at the core of how universities should be governed. That doesn't mean that there won't be situations in which there might need to be more enforcement. And also we have tools like Title VI in the Office of Civil Rights that we should be using to hold universities accountable to their obligations here. And so, for example, when the administration is talking about the importance of protecting Jewish students on campus, or sending in the National Guard to campuses or something like that, and then gutting the Office of Civil Rights, which enforces Title VI, that's the core tool we have. And so we should be starting by enforcing Title VI. New York just passed a bill to ensure Title VI coordinators on all campuses. It was sponsored by a number of elected officials, including Nili Rozik from Queens, who's an Israeli American assemblywoman, and a friend of mine from like a long time ago in New York government, and someone who I think thinks thoughtfully about this. And so in the absence of federal leadership, we also can think about what we can do on the state and local levels to ensure we're holding universities to their obligations to protect students, and that the government has recourse, whether it's the state or federal government, depending on who's willing to actually do it and invest in it, to hold them accountable when they don't. But I think utilizing local police departments and the National Guard for sure should be a last case scenario rather than the default, as we've seen certain mayors and presidents suggest.
Thank you. Someone wants to discuss, this is a JTA op-ed written by 3 residents of Astoria who felt bad with Mamdani as their city council member that, again, this is a permission structure question, that their children, a certain kind of reflexive way of talking about Israel was normalized to a way that made them, their children in public schools, and the writers in, I guess we call them civic settings, who are really uncomfortable. So I guess the question is if you would comment on that, and I guess maybe because of the position you're at, how would you call that out if you really felt like rhetoric has gotten to a place that's just being, that's not being, it's not about being policed, but it's being condoned, I guess, at a certain level that's making these Jewish residents feel unsafe in their homes?
I didn't see the op-ed, but I can imagine what it's speaking to, because it's the same trends and themes that I think many of us have understood and experienced, particularly over the last 2 years, but also in certain places long before that. So it's this idea that there's perhaps like a litmus test for being Jewish in certain spaces, that you have to effectively condemn Israel or something like that in order to feel comfortable in these spaces. And so I'd say there's 2 pieces. I think first and foremost, the work that we can do, and this is something I talked about on the AOC webinar, and I've talked about with the mayor-elect and others, is how do we actually understand the Jewish community's relationship with Israel, and how at the end of the day, for many Jews, a relationship with Israel is part of our identity, again, even if we have fundamental disagreements with its government. And so understanding how Jewish self-determination and a connection to this place in the world is part of our identity and our history, again, which is not an endorsement of its government, the same way that most of us in this room probably don't endorse most actions and ideas of the American government right now, right? I think. And so part of that is helping socialize and understand what the Jewish community's relationship with Israel. And that doesn't mean that every one of us has a relationship with Israel. There are definitely parts of the Jewish community who don't, or who have even an oppositional relationship with Israel, and that's their prerogative, and that's okay. But for the majority of American Jews, right now, we still have this connection, and it's important to help our leaders and others understand that. And then I think it's also this broader conversation around what it means to create litmus tests in our schools and otherwise for people to feel accepted and safe. And that's most important. That's a place where the mayor-elect and others have a disproportionate impact in terms of the curriculum we're teaching, in terms of the ways in which teachers and others are empowered to actually do something about that, the ways in which we can, I would say particularly those of us, like we work with AFT and UFT on issues of anti-Semitism. How do we help educators understand what it means to engage on these issues in a way that allows Jewish and all students to feel welcome and safe in the classrooms? And so that's a place where actually local policy matters. And so, for example, the Department of Ed just implemented this Hidden Voices curriculum, which is about not just understanding who Jews are, but not just understanding anti-Semitism, but in particularly understanding who Jews are. Because we so often try to teach Jewish identity and counter anti-Semitism through teaching Holocaust education, which certainly matters. They say this as the grandkid of Holocaust survivors. But the way that we actually fight anti-Semitism in its contemporary forms is also helping people understand who Jews are today and what matters to us, our values, our relationships, our connections. And so this new curriculum, which I have no indication that the new mayor is going to do away with, right, is one of the tools we have to do that. And how do we use curriculum to actually advance a broader understanding so that students like these three parents' kids actually feel safe in their schools? How are we empowering teachers to understand how they can talk about issues like the Middle East without crossing the line into creating a litmus test or making Jewish or other students feel like they're being asked to pick a side or to answer a question in order to engage in conversations. And we're not giving a lot of these people the tools to even do that. And so it's not a surprise that this is playing out in the way it is, because we haven't really thought constructively about how we empower educators and administrators and others to do this well. And so I think what we can do as both the Jewish community and certainly as a mayoral administration for the incoming mayor is think about how we're empowering educators and administrators to actually understand this, and how we are teaching our students about who Jews are today and what our relationship is with Israel and more broadly in a way that is sort of hitting that lowest common denominator of understanding where most of us are.
So this will have to be, I think, our last question. And it's appropriate to this setting. I'm going to combine two questions about the role of the synagogue. So the first was just if you have any thoughts about rabbis endorsing from the pulpit. And the second one is, in a setting like this, what can synagogues do? And what can you do for synagogues where there are often binaries, where people only see things through the lens of either their ideologies? So how do you think about partnering with synagogues and about their role in the political sphere?
Well, look, until about this year, most faith leaders and houses of worship were not legally allowed to endorse from the pulpit under something called the Johnson Amendment, and JCPA has been very deeply supportive of the Johnson Amendment for many years, and we remain so. And so I think there's two questions there. I think just generally, right, I don't think houses of worship should be places where electioneering happens, because they're supposed to be inclusive spaces where all of us are welcome. But also I think we as Jews need to think about what it means if we're opening this door. Because right now, right, in the mayoral race in New York, it might have been used by some who think that they're advancing Jewish interest, and I certainly think that that's true for some of the rabbis who endorsed for or against Mamdani. I think they were genuinely doing this from a place of good faith in many cases, and a commitment to Jewish safety and values. But what does it mean to actually open the door to houses of worship being used as political tools? That's not going to end well for the Jewish community in a country where we're only 2% of the population, and we're seeing things like white Christian nationalism become increasingly normalized across the 50 states. And so we need to think about the unintended consequences of opening the door to this, And there's a reason why most of the denominations have been deeply committed to the houses of worship and the pulpit remaining nonpartisan and not endorsing in elections. That's different than weighing in on contentious or political issues, right? Synagogues are also inherent to our civic life and to our identity of Jews as Jews and our values and our safety. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't take positions on key issues of policy and fundamental values. When ICE is raiding our cities, when we might have a mayor that says something that is out of step with our safety, then we should certainly make sure our synagogues and our rabbis and our clergy are empowered to call that out. But that's different than electioneering and endorsing. And how we make sure that our synagogues and our broader Jewish institutions can stand up for Jewish safety and Jewish values in all of its forms, while not wading into the electioneering in a way that I think opens the door to so much that might fundamentally undermine our safety in the long term is going to be the real conversation in the Jewish community over the next few years. And I mean, we're a nonpartisan organization. The IRS has not changed my ability to electioneer, and so I still won't, and I certainly won't, because I'm sure the IRS will find any reason to come after a liberal Jewish organization in the next couple of months. But I hope our synagogues, even if they have the permission to do that, remain committed to our values and our safety rather than specific partisan or electioneering positions.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank Amy Spitalnick. Thank you for coming, and Rabbi Sol.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to ask one last question of Andrew, because Amy, I just want to acknowledge her leadership, which has been navigating a very fine line in the Jewish community, and an important one, of nuance and leadership at a time when the Jewish community's leaders have not been as nuanced as she has, and she's been able to hold space in that way. So kudos to Amy and the JCPA, which I think when we've looked towards how institutions are holding up in this moment, she's been a shining light. So I just want to acknowledge that. I just want to ask Andrew, since you've been the one asking questions, but you've certainly had a mezzanine seat to this moment as a journalist, and you've done a lot of writing about like the diversity in the community. So I just want to ask you, from your mezzanine seat, if you were writing an op-ed to how the Jewish community should behave moving forward, given how we've kind of devolved over the last couple of months, and how this election has been such, so divisive, so scary in many ways, and how the community itself has fallen apart in that, what would you say is the kind of charge that you would give?
So the word that actually jumped out at me from the cards is this binary thinking. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we have now. And it's not helped by the fact that the people we often disagree with are also engaged in binary thinking. And I see it all the time. I'm a reader of New York Magazine, right? Because I want to know what the kids are up to. I want to know what fashion is, just so I don't look like a complete idiot when I talk to my daughter. So there's a reflex in New York Magazine of sort of an anti-Israelism, which is just like really interesting to me. And I guess it's upsetting, but it's interesting, because it's a non-binary. It basically suggests that if you're a Zionist, you can't be a liberal, and if you're a liberal, you can't be a Zionist. And those are two things that the Jewish community has been for so long, both those things. And it just frustrates me when that I think a lot of people who are critical of Israel have a lot in common with liberal Zionists, except only one of them believes that the state of Israel deserves to exist. And my charge, and I try to stress this because I often write about the discourse. I try to find the people who are trying to look past the binaries and say, like, I hear you, I understand your fear, but here's why I feel differently. Or here's another way of thinking about it. And or yes, I understand you're upset with the Israeli government, but you should also know that a lot of people in Israel who are fighting for the kind of Israel that certainly I would like to see and maybe you would like to see. So that's usually what I hope. And I think we have an advantage. We're a nonpartisan Jewish organization where we try to present all sides of the Jewish conversation. And I think that's one step to go in getting past non-binary thinking, engaging in a conversation.
So I just want to also, I've noticed if you've read Andrew over the last couple of months how he's been doing that. He will interview people from across the spectrum and model in many ways a conversation, even if the people aren't having it, they're having it in your article. So yasher koach to that. So I want to thank everyone for coming, those who are here in person, those who are joining us live stream. I want to give a yasher koach to Rabbi Shuli Passo, who's organizing the whole series. Our next event is on December 2nd with Professor Derek Penzler from Harvard, who was the head of the Harvard Commission on Anti-Semitism that did that research. He's going to be speaking about the nature of the university system and how the Jewish people have been playing in that way, and how anti-Semitism on campus has been playing as a part of the series of American Judaism and a Crossroads. We want to thank Amy and Andrew once again for being here at this most important moment and giving some insight to how we think about this and move ahead. And we want to thank NYJA, the New York Jewish Agenda, for co-sponsoring this event, and all of you who are here. Shabbat Shalom.